Addiction sucks. It is a condition that affects all walks of life, from the young to the old. Addiction does not discriminate based on anything: age, sex, race, or any of that crap. It knows no boundaries and will never apologize. Addiction does not care about the circumstances under which a person becomes an addict, and it sure as hell does not care if you become an addict by accident.
I'm sitting on my doorstep, the people's passing by. They're coming back from getting wrecked, everybody's high. Saturday night, what a bitch, laying on the lawn. The morning comes to bring the switch after the buzz is gone.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Addictions, the podcast about addictions. I'm your host, David Wagner. Today on the show we are going to be talking about accidental addiction. But before we get into the thick of it, I want to remind everyone that you can go back and listen to any of the past episodes of the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Play, and really anywhere that you find podcasts. You can do the same by visiting addictionspodcast.com. And while you're there, be sure to click on the contact link at the top of the page and say hello. On to the subject of this episode, accidental addiction. Now, whether the cause be simply doctors carelessly prescribing long-term prescriptions of opioids for minor chronic pain, or even inheriting a genetic predisposition to become addicted to a certain substance or behavior, this is somewhat of a controversial subject. But then again, I guess the entire subject of addiction itself is a bit controversial. Well, maybe controversial is the wrong word. Addiction is something that we sometimes don't want to talk about. It can often be the elephant in the room, so to speak, that nobody wants to address. And in part, I feel like that is kind of how we got to where we are now, at least here in the United States, with the current opioid epidemic. It seems like this is something that has been going on for a long time without being addressed, and it's getting to the point where it's kind of reaching a tipping point, really. In fact, at one point in 2015, roughly 92 million Americans used an opioid painkiller that was prescribed to them by a doctor. When we really examine that number, and take into account that there are a little over 300 million people in the United States, and about 74 million of those people are young children who are rarely prescribed opioid narcotics, this tells us that basically 1/3 of Americans were prescribed opioid narcotics in 2015. Now, I hate to have to single out the United States here, but the fact of the matter is that this epidemic of addiction and drug overdose is simply not happening at the same levels in most other countries, some of which have had things like codeine available over the counter without a prescription from a doctor required for a long time. Now, that's not to say that these other countries don't have drug abuse problems or issues, because they do, but it's just nowhere near the numbers that we see here in the United States. It gets even crazier, though. In 2012, there were 13 states that had more prescriptions for opioid narcotics than they had people. My home state of Michigan is one of them. And this tells us that, simply put, doctors have been overprescribing opioid narcotics in the United States, no doubt about it. And this is what leads us to the subject of this episode: accidental addiction. Around the globe, there are tons of people who still define drug addiction as a choice, even as mountains of evidence support the fact that addiction is a medical disease. The typical reason that most people kind of hold on to this viewpoint is because they see it as a choice for people to use drugs in the first place. If people did not choose to do this, then they would not become addicts. Plain and simple, right? But for many addicts, the initial use of a substance was not a choice to get high or to become addicted. And I can tell you, I have met and talked with so many addicts over the past decade who I would consider accidental addicts, definitely. They develop an addiction or physical dependence to a substance after taking a prescription given to them by a doctor for legitimate medical needs. Even in my own opioid addiction, I truly feel that I sort of fell into it. I broke my left femur, the biggest bone in the human body, in a car accident. And as a result, I developed multiple conditions that caused chronic pain. I developed sciatica, sacroiliac dysfunction, and spinal stenosis, all resulting from that terrible car accident. Anyways, I was prescribed opioids long-term for over 4 years straight, every single day. And of course I became physically dependent on the drugs. I don't think that it's possible to be on opioids every single day for 4 years and not develop a physical dependence to those drugs. Now for me, I noticed it at first in the mornings. I would wake up and just feel like shit. Sometimes even getting sick, throwing up, headache, all kinds of just terrible symptoms. That is, until I took my morning dose of hydrocodone. After that morning dose, it was all smiles and rainbows. I do want to note that my chronic pain did not really ramp up until about 2 years after the car accident. See, over time, my walking stance, or my gait, had drastically changed because of the injury. This began to cause other major problems, and on top of that, I had a second surgery to remove the titanium rod that had been inserted into my left femur to stabilize it. And during that surgery to remove that titanium rod, the surgeon actually severed my sciatic nerve. This began to cause all sorts of nerve pain and lower back pain. It cascaded into a myriad of just terrible issues that I had to deal with. And I tried many treatments before settling on opioid narcotics. I tried cortisone injections with little to no relief, and a procedure called a rhizotomy. Now, in a rhizotomy, doctors use an electrode that's on the end of a long, wiry needle to go in and burn the nerve endings, which actually helped with some of my nerve pain, but definitely not all of my chronic pain. The thing about the rhizotomy procedure is that it can only be done once every 6 months, and I was not getting 6 months of relief from that procedure. Basically, the nerve endings would grow back after a couple of months, and I would be right back to square one. And again, that procedure can only be done once every 6 months. So it really wasn't a viable option for me to control my chronic pain. Long story short, I was on the opioids by prescription for a little over 4 years and not given any warning about addiction or dependence by my doctor in any way. And when a doctor prescribes a medication, typically people will take that medication. It's a doctor, for Christ's sakes. These people are supposed to be smart, right? They go to medical school for like 8 years or something, right? Well, doctors are people too, and as people, we all do stupid-ass things from time to time, I guess. In my case, after I realized I was becoming physically dependent to the drugs, I actually went to my doctor and I explained to her that I was a bit worried about this physical dependence, to which she stated that the hospital can treat that if it comes down to that. I was a little bit concerned about that answer, but at that point, I just sort of figured that the opioids were probably going to be a lifelong medication. But oh, how wrong I was. Flash forward to about 4 years later, and I was at the point where I was building a massive tolerance to opioids. I began taking double and even triple my normal dose of hydrocodone, just to not be sick, just to feel normal. And by doing that, I was blowing through my supply of pills at an alarming rate. It got to the point where I had to call in my prescription a week or two early, and at first, this wasn't a big problem, it wasn't an issue. My doctor seemed to have no problem issuing my prescription refills early. After the 4th or 5th time that I called my prescription in early, I got a letter in the mail stating that I was simply no longer going to be a patient. My doctor was cutting me off. My jaw literally hit the floor, and at first I was really angry. I mean, what happened to treating my dependence on these drugs that my doctor mentioned in the past? Apparently that was no longer an option, I guess. After my anger, I began to get a little frantic and anxious because I realized that without these drugs, on a daily basis, I was going to have to go through days and days of physical withdrawal, and to be honest with you, I was fucking scared to death. Not to mention all of the psychological issues and stuff that come along with opioid withdrawal. Now, this is what led me to begin buying pills on the street, which I realized very quickly was an incredibly expensive endeavor, as street dealers do not take no-fault auto insurance claims as payment. It got so bad that I was spending 80 to 90% of my weekly paycheck on pills just to not be sick and not miss work and not lose my job. But unfortunately, my story is not unique. There are literally millions of people who find themselves in the same exact situation. And many of them end up turning to heroin as a cheaper and more potent alternative to buying prescription pills on the street for $5 a piece. Looking back, it really blows my mind that I did not turn to heroin. In the long run, it would have been so much cheaper for me to do that. But it also would have been a much more dangerous situation, and who knows? I could have wound up as just another overdose statistic like so many people tragically already have. So what is the solution here? What do we do to fix these problems? We know that doctors have been overprescribing these drugs, and that in part stems from all of these big pharmaceutical companies like Purdue Pharma, who is actually being sued right now, for pushing doctors to prescribe these drugs more and more. And because of the fact that these very same companies actually began telling doctors and healthcare officials that opioids are not as addicting as once thought, which is total bullshit. In fact, back in 1895, when Bayer Pharmaceuticals first developed diamorphine, a drug more commonly known as heroin, it was first used as a non-addictive substitute for morphine, and to wean those already hooked on morphine off of morphine. But again, those pharmaceutical companies were wrong, and it looks like history is repeating itself right now with the current opioid epidemic. In my case, yes, I was initially using the drugs to combat my very real chronic pain. But in the end, it got to the point where I was simply taking the opioids to feel normal and to not be sick. And it all just spiraled out of control from there. We know that people have issues with pain. We know that opioids are not really a viable option for long-term pain relief in most situations. Don't get me wrong, there are numerous other situations where opioids are required for long-term pain management, but not in my case. Yes, I had, and I still have, chronic pain that resulted from breaking my left femur. But rather than opioids, I wish that my doctor would have looked more towards things like physical therapy and that type of thing. But again, as this may work for me, it may not work for everyone. The simple fact of the matter is this: there is no one-size-fits-all Band-Aid that's going to make all of these drug abuse and addiction problems go away. In some cases, there are underlying psychological issues that put some people at a greater risk for developing addiction than others. Things like depression and anxiety and other mental issues can put people in situations where they begin self-medicating with drugs. In other cases, it's what's known as a genetic predisposition. This occurs when you have inherited genes from your parents who may have a history of addiction problems in the past, in turn causing you to have a higher risk for addiction in the first place. It is my feeling that to really tackle not just the opioid problem, but all drug abuse and addiction problems, we need to work more towards individualized treatment. Everyone is different, and everyone has different circumstances that led them to become addicts in the first place. Doing this in conjunction with better educating healthcare professionals about addiction, rather than letting the drug manufacturers themselves educate the doctors on addiction, I really feel like we would be on the right track. Beyond that, we need to keep talking. We need to keep addiction and drug abuse in the public eye while at the same time removing that negative stigma that comes along with addiction. It is incredibly difficult for people to want to reach out for help when they feel like a criminal or like a piece of garbage because they have the label of addict slapped across their face. So those would all be good steps in reducing addiction and overdose rates, not just here in the United States, but worldwide. As always, I want to thank each and every one of you so much for listening. And if you really like the show and you want to get your hands on some bonus audio and video content, check out patreon.com/addictions to learn more. For as little as $1 a month, you can gain access to hilarious outtakes, extra video content, and so much more. I'm adding more and more stuff every month. So again, check out patreon.com/addictions. That's patreon.com/addictions to learn more. If you would like to support the show with just a one-time donation of any amount, rather than monthly donations, we also accept PayPal, and you can find that link to donate via PayPal by visiting addictionspodcast.com/donate now. And if you are on Facebook, be sure to follow the Addictions Podcast at facebook.com/addictionspodcast. I post all sorts of updates there, and it's a really great place for all of us to interact and share our own stories. We even have a private group, so be sure to check that out. The show is also on Twitter at twitter.com/addictionscast. Alternatively, we are at addictionscast. Again, I can't thank you all enough for listening, and remember, never quit quitting.
You spent your money freely, then you smashed your only car. You aren't what you are really. You missed it by so damn far. Your head feels like it's in a blender, and you hate to see the dawn. Your stomach says return to sender after the buzz is gone. Your Sundays you prayed Uncle John. You poisoned yourself last night. Mary slapped your friend Tom. You got in a hell of a fight. Monday comes and it's back to work. The week seems so damn long. The weekend's past, you're still a jerk after the buzz